Hi, welcome to My Psychic Manifesto. I'm your host, Ian Peckrell. This is a talk show dedicated to exploring the work of Jane Roberts in a body of work known as the Seth Material. Today, I'll be this will be a series of interviews, but I'll be interviewing Barrie Gellis, one of the New York boys. Barrie Gellis published a book called The Seth Material Q&A, which was basically like a Dear Abby, but questions posed to Barrie based on the Seth Material. Barrie Gellis he knew Jane Roberts, and he lived in New York City and around 72 and attended a lot of Jane Roberts had ESP classes in Elmira, New York. So with that, I would like to introduce Barrie Gellis. Barrie, welcome to My Psychic Manifesto. I'm really honored that you were willing to be interviewed.
Hi, here I am. There you are. And the book was not quite like a Dear Abby. You know, it was it was more like a Dear, what does this mean? Basically. But anyway, Abby
Part
will
of
be
it was,
happy.
well, the second half I thought was more like, it was like readers or people, saying, hey, Barrie, why did Jane Roberts die? If she was such a powerful psychic, why did she die of, this disease? If she was such a, and then you would go on and answer that question. So that was
I
like
answered all questions. So
I'll take it. Questions and answers.
I'll take a Dear Abby, no problem.
Yeah.
Dear Abby 2.0.
Let's kind of start at the beginning. How did you hear of Seth, and how did you meet Jane Roberts?
How did I hear of Seth? Okay, when I had gone to from Queens, all the New York boys lived in Queens, New York. I had gone to Texas for a few months. When I came back, my friends, let's say Ricky Stack and Dickie, who was Dickie Nissenbaum, and now he was Richard Kendall. But they had started going to Jane's class. They were aware of Jane through what was called the Gnosis and Francois. In any case, when I came home, and I wasn't interested in that because it was very negative, but when I came home, they were involved with the Seth stuff, and they showed me, I think it was Dickie in the candy store, he showed me something Jane wrote about raindrops all coming together, and he said it's nothing like the Gnosis, it's very positive. So when I looked at what he read, I thought I agreed with everything he said. So I said I would go up. I was thinking, I've been positive about the universe and myself my whole life. I don't know if it was 2 or 1, but basically what I remember is my whole life. I had, like I said, I wrote the war in Vietnam has love in the background, and people are good. I believe all that stuff. So I believed all the positive things that Seth said. He just filled it in. He added a lot more connecting dots. Like I had an idea here and an idea here, and then he connected them as well. But so I was not looking for Seth. I was not looking for answers. I was just trusting myself. But Seth fit right in. So they told me about it, and I went up to class, and then that was it. I was there for about a year.
How often did you go? Was it Tuesday night? She had classes that were basically open to people interested in that.
It was every Tuesday night. Now we're in Queens, so it's a 5-hour drive from Queens to Elmira. So we would leave at about 1 in the afternoon on Tuesday. On the way up, about halfway, there was a place called Roscoe's Diner, which we never heard of, but then we found out it's like a popular place on Route 17 or whatever it was. We'd stop at Roscoe's Diner, we'd continue to Jane's. We'd get to Jane at about 7 p.m. The class was from like 4 hours. It was like 7 to 11, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It was like 7 to 11. There was a 15-minute break or something in between. So then we'd go to the class, finish the class, have the break. And then afterwards, we'd go by a McDonald's that was like nearby. And then we would begin the trip home, another 5-hour drive. So we'd get home at about 5 in the morning, let's say. So we would leave at about, I don't know if it was at 2 in the afternoon, around there, and get home 5 in the morning the next day, I guess. It's one day from us being awake, but going technically by the sun and the calendar, you'd say it's the next day. So that was the trip. We drove up there, and there would be sometimes 1 car, sometimes 4 cars, depending upon how many people came with us up there. But that was what the journey was like.
And she would hold these classes out of her home in her living room, if I remember right.
it would be in a living room, and always use the term class because that's what it was called, but it was really nothing like a class. It was like people gathered in a living room. It was just a normal living room, and she had a rocking chair there. She'd rock. And then there was a couch, there were some chairs, there was a rug, there was a radiator. So the people just sat around on the floor, on the couch, on the chairs, or on the radiator, and talked. So it was like maybe a meeting of some sort,
Mm.
gathering. So to me, this is just me, when I think of the word class, I think more of a formal structure. Like there's desks, there's a teacher. In this case, Jane would be the teacher. Hi, I'm Jane. I'm the teacher. I will. Now, it wasn't like that. She did lead the meeting, but it wasn't formal like that. It wasn't that rigid. Like, this is Jane, this is the class, this is the lesson. It was just like a group of people talking. And then in the middle of the talking, that's when Seth would come through, and Jane would remove her glasses, which I would do if my headphones weren't blocking them. And then you knew Jane was out. Otherwise, you wouldn't be aware of it at the time. But when the glasses came off, everybody got quiet and listened to what Seth said. Some people would ask questions. Seth would take some questions, maybe not. Sometimes, which was the most fun in a way, he would just sit around, like he would stop talking, but he was still there. So he was almost like one of the people, and we would be talking just with him sitting there. But usually it would be over. Jane would like put her glasses back on and go like she does in the video. It's like it's
Right.
over, and she would point. She'd say, "Well, what did he say? Jeffrey, what did he say?" I'm glad she never called on me because I was so nervous that if she called on me, I wouldn't have been able to say anything. But she never did. So maybe they picked up on that. And
Now,
and also sometimes I just want to say Jane would
yep.
sometimes also read. If she was working on personal reality then. So sometimes she'd read something from that, or she'd read a poem. And we'd also go over every class, the guy named you made up a transcript. They're called the class transcripts.
Mhm.
And when we came back the next week, they would hand out the transcripts. So he would type it up, I guess, Xerox it. So we would all get the transcript from the week before, and we'd look at that, read it, not formally read the whole thing, but look it over. Someone might bring up anything from that, and I said Jane would talk. And then in the middle of all this, without, not being asked to come, but he was welcome, Seth would just come through and then start speaking about a comment somebody made or a correction or something like that.
In
Okay.
the book you're talking about, when you say personal reality, is her book, The Nature of Personal Reality.
Right.
And you said she never called on you, but didn't at the end of class, didn't Seth himself, so Jane would take off her glasses, she would go into trance as Seth. And did Seth, is it true Seth referred to you as our poet?
Yeah, Seth referred to me as a poet. Seth talked to me. I'm just referring specifically to when Seth left and Jane came back
Mm-hmm.
and asked the class. She always would ask somebody, what happened? What did he say? And she never asked me that question, gladly,
Oh,
because I
okay.
didn't want her to ask me. Because I was, nervous in the class. It's a lot of, it's a number of people, but especially I wouldn't have been able to think anything. My mind would have went blank. So, but that's all I was referring to. Yeah.
Okay.
When Seth called me our poet,
Yeah.
I had read a poem in class. My very first class, Seth never came through. So my second class is when I read this poem. And at the end of that class, Seth said, referred to me as our poet.
By the way, Barrie Gellis wrote the lyrics and helped with the music to our theme song, Secrets of the Moving Dust. They're available on YouTube, and we'll put up some links to those. Barrie, you have a book of poetry, as well as the Seth Material Q&A.
So
Don't you have a book of poetry?
I happen to have it right here.
Oh,
I'm not sure how that happened.
Go ahead, plug it.
I don't know. I can't. Oh, it's foggy.
We'll
I
have
mean,
Tom. That's
here it
okay.
is.
Tom will
This
put
is
up.
what it looks like. Yay!
We
You can get
got
it
you.
on.
What's the title? Outside, it's a secret key. Outside.
Outside is a secret key.
Outside is a secret key.
Yeah, and you
That's
can get it
available on Kindle, right?
on Kindle, I think, and Amazon. I forget if it's on Kindle or not. It probably is. I don't remember, but you can get it on Amazon. You can get it. Well, if I have copies, you can get it from me also. anything you want, anybody a listener wants, it's bargell, BARGELL at AOL.com. You can ask any follow-up questions or comments or whatever you want. That's how you could contact me.
Barry, you also have a Facebook page too, right? The Barry, what's the
I
name
do. I do.
of your
I don't.
Facebook group?
Yeah, it's on Facebook. I think it's called Barrie Gellis Facebook page. All things Seth, something like that. I don't know the address at all, but it's on Facebook. I guess you could find it.
We'll put up some links to it too.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about, so you were the New York boys. Were most of the people from New York, or if I understand right, most of the people that would go to her ESP classes on Tuesday were locals, people actually from Elmira, which is about, upstate New York, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I said, like, I got a 5-hour drive about from New York. Most of the people were from up or that area. So I guess that's why we were the New York boys, not New York state, but New York City, but not really New York City because it was Queens. But Queens is a borough of New York City. But when you're in Queens, you refer to the city as Manhattan. I'm going to go to the city, it means Manhattan. But anyway, so we were the New York boys. We were all hippie looking people, long hair. I posted some pictures and stuff. So we were very different than most of the people there. And there was the thing called the generation gap at that point. So, and there's don't trust anybody over 35, like there's an expression. So there was that kind of a separation, about the war in Vietnam, about drugs, which Seth talked a lot about, different drugs. He's differentiated between like LSD and marijuana. He said pot is more natural, but LSD you got to be careful with. We had a guest there, a guest once, whatever, who was using LSD in his therapy, and he was telling her you got to use a little amount and other things. So, the thing, I guess, sex, drugs, rock and roll, and things like the war, those were generation gap things. So it was not quite a clash. It was just a union of a wave, let's say, of coming from two different places. But there were people at the meeting. I'm calling it the meeting now. I don't know, at the class, like Sue was there. She was all totally in tune with us, and there were other people our age around who were. It was mostly the older people who, if there was any kind of clash or differences, that it would be on that level. And we, as I said, we look different.
What was the atmosphere like during class?
The atmosphere was very.
Was it stuffy?
Oh no, I'll tell you the atmosphere. The atmosphere was very unstuffy, very friendly. The lights were on. It was very unspiritual. There was like no darkness and candle lights. There was loud talking. I hope there's a beep I'm hearing. Can you hear that? I hope
yes.
not.
No, I did not hear the beep.
Okay, good.
No,
excellent. Okay, so there was it was totally, there was loud talking, there was cursing, there was smoking, and it was very unspiritual. It's stereotypical spiritual. Spiritual. Seth once said, like, the spirituality is like the spring is a cult. Springtime. So there was nothing that you would think of as the spiritual atmosphere, but it was friendly. It was loud. Sometimes there was arguing, sometimes not. One thing I liked about Seth was sometimes there would be a guest, and somehow he got there, and I would think, and my friends, not that we all think alike, but he would say something, and we would think, or talk for a while, and we would think like he was an idiot or like a moron. How could he say that? And we'd kind of argue a little bit. What are you talking about? How could you say that? Blah blah. Seth would come through. He would make the exact point we were making, but do it in such a way that it was like a compliment to the person. He had a way sometimes of addressing people, to make them feel good about themselves. And in this case, he was making him, I think it was him or her, feel, because it happened more than once, feel good about herself, but not losing any of the point that we were upset over. It wasn't like, oh, no, don't say that. It's not this, it's not that. He said, in a sense, exactly what we were saying, but he worded it in such a way that ended up being like a compliment to the person, making the person feel good. That is an admirable trait. which I don't have. I aspire to have it. Sometimes I have it.
Well, that was one of the things that kind of struck me about the Seth Material too, is not only was Seth incredibly intelligent, he was compassionate, and he had a fantastic sense of humor. I mean, he was really a very well-rounded, and he was never sarcastic with that great intellect. You know, some of the topics he discussed and he got across, some of the ideas were very simple in the Seth Material, and some of the ideas were also very sophisticated philosophical concepts. So there's a great intellect behind all this, also tempered with compassion and humor. But yeah, Seth never spoke down to anybody.
Yeah. He, Jane didn't take off someplace. Jane was still in there. And sometimes she said she'd get images of what Seth was talking about. And he had to use her vocabulary. He used her poetic abilities. He speaks very, very poetically often. I once made a few of his things into a poem to look like it. And again, like you said, so he was poetic, earthy, had a sense of humor. So yeah, he was all those things. I used to, when he says good night at the end of each class session, I think the book sessions as well, he'd say, at least in class sessions, good night or bye, all the blessings I have to give you, I'll give you. Those you have to find on your own, you'll find on your own. But sometimes, like I was just looking up something else, and he said good night. He referred to Jane and Rob as pickleheads. He said good night, good night, my
Yeah.
pickleheads. Or I think we should take a break, my pickleheads. So he would say funny things like that. And when we were cursing, I'm going to be using the word fucking and fuck, just gods don't mind, because that was the class was on that and on that word. And we were talking, he was talking a lot about it. And then at the end, he said, this fucking class is now over, later on. So he threw that in. He was very big on the body is the soul and flesh. The flesh and the body are both holy, not his word, and both spiritual. You can't separate one from the other. And physical reality is a positive thing. It's not something to escape or to run away from. And so so sex, part of the body, which is, part of your soul, the soul and the body are wedded. So sex was not thought of as a bad thing or in class, although some of the uptighter older people had their views. And and again, a lot of people, spiritual, I'm putting spiritual people, but they are, so I'll take that away. A lot of spiritual people believe like physical reality is something you have to overcome or avoid.
That's one of the things that really, it's some of the differences in the Seth Material as opposed to like Eastern philosophy. Like, if you talk about the Buddhist concept of nirvana, where you wanted like not only sex, but like the ego. If you were a Buddhist, the idea of nirvana means like, the ego's destroyed, desires are bad. Whereas Seth is saying that, the ego may have become somewhat of a bully and takes on more of a function in the psyche than it was designed to. Seth describes the ego, these days as being like somebody who's muscle bound. It's become so powerful, the rest of the body can't function. But Seth doesn't write the ego off as the redheaded stepchild of the psyche.
No, it's even more than that. You could be muscle bound, quote unquote, because from the ego, but the ego, according to Seth, is that part of the inner self whose job is to focus intently on physical reality, receive information and feed information back to the inner self and receive information from the inner self. So you can't separate the ego from this inner self. I mean, it's just a part of it. It's like not something sitting on top of it that you could cut off or anything like that. So it's really a part of the inner self. But he did also say, like you said, it got to be relied on too much, too overused, to the expense of other things. But it's all right there to be used. The ego, he said, expands. The more knowledge you get, the ego takes it in and expands. So it just becomes more of itself, let's say, more connected to the inner self. So it's a question of the ego expanding, not the ego diminishing in any way or being replaced or anything like that.
Yes, Seth had described the ego as the outermost part of the inner self, or the part that sort of sits on the windowsill, the I, and he kind of played, like Seth likes to play with words, like the I, meaning the I, letter I, or the EYE, the I that looks out onto the world, the outermost part of the inner self. Barry, so you mentioned like around 1972, is that when you were going to
Yeah,
class?
I want to just say one thing about playing
Go
on
ahead.
words. Seth at one time was saying something, I think it was the Seth about the class about, might have been about this, the sex thing. In any case, he said something, and a person asked him, did you say organism or orgasm? And
Yeah,
Seth said, well, they're the same thing.
yeah. Oh,
And
organism or orgasm.
he just said it's the same thing.
He
So
had a
that's his
way
play,
with,
that's his play on words, which is Jane's poetry influence, I believe.
and that's one of the reasons that Seth chose Jane, right? Like, wasn't he looking for somebody that had the abilities? She had the abilities as a medium.
That's
Why do you think that's it? I'm
well,
going to pose that to you as a question. Why did Seth choose Jane?
yeah. Seth chose Jane very specifically because he was he was related to her from past lives. They shared the same entity, I believe. I think that was the word they used. And also so did Rob. So Seth said he couldn't even come through if it wasn't for both Rob and Jane. He needed them together, especially with no, with very little distortion. He said this material is as, I'm using the word pure, I don't think he did, as pure
With
as it could
distortion.
come from my dimension to yours.
Hmm.
There always has to be some distortion, but it can't be any, this is the least distorted as possible. And then of course he could make corrections if she got something wrong or mistook something. So he picked Jane and he said he was training her for like before, like lifetimes. And so it was something that she had to agree to, but he specifically had this connection, this past life connection. Like Jane sort of grew from a probable reality of some Seth, focal personality. I think it was like, let's make up a year, 4th century, like a 4th century personality that had a probable reality. And I think Jane stemmed from this person's probable reality, something along those lines, but I'd have to look it up again. But they were connected with Rob, and he was very connected to Rob. They were both, but Jane is the one that had the ability to speak, and Rob got his images. He got dream images and painted them. But he wasn't just an ordinary person getting images. He was connected to Seth as well. So Jane, so Seth said he's only going to communicate through Jane to keep the authenticity of the material and the integrity of the material. And nowadays the people said, "Oh, Seth's in my dreams. Seth communicating with me." Seth repeatedly said, "That's not going to happen. It doesn't happen. My work is only going to be through Jane, so everybody knows it's authentic." And that doesn't mean until she dies, because it's even more important that it's only through Jane, because as some people say, oh, he can come through anyone now. That would totally mean that Seth not only hid that from Jane and Rob when Jane was dying and this and that, but he would say, well, the integrity only counts when Jane's alive, but now once she's dead, I don't care about the authenticity and the integrity anymore. I'll just come through anyone who asks. So it doesn't fit. Anyone who actually, I compiled about 22 quotes on this, but anyone who actually has read them, because I posted them, you could see clearly that, and there's many people that said, I talked to you in my dream, and Seth said, no, it was not me, that was you were using me as a symbol, or that is what you interpret I would have said. Like there was a guy in class, Arthur, he was a New York boy, said I'm doing an out of body, trying to, and I get scared when I try. And then I heard your voice say to me something about Mona Lisa smiling. And I don't understand that, he said. So Seth, what was that? And he said, well, first of all, that was your interpretation of what you think I would say in that situation. That wasn't me. And then he went on to, whatever they talked about. A number of times everybody's so sure that it's Seth. And nobody even did anything before Jane made the name popular. But when Jane was around and Seth was around to answer, it's not like they're 100% sure. They're totally sure. And each and every time Seth would say, it wasn't me, it's a symbol of me. And Jane would explain that. Jane sometimes once she got annoyed at people. It was about 2 years before she died, 2.5 years. And she said, it really annoys me as people are so gullible and just could fall for believe anything that people tell them. And, I don't want my material contaminated. And these people are riding on my coattails. So she was upset, and Jane and Seth didn't say, "Oh, don't worry about it, Jane. After you die," and in The Way Towards Health, which I sarcastically called The Way Towards Death because she died during the book. But in that book, he could have said, "Don't worry. When you do pass on, I'll be here and I'll speak through other people." And Rob pointed out, he never said that. He had plenty of opportunities. He could have said it at any time. All he's ever said is, I'm going to give the material through Jane. That's it, to maintain the integrity and authenticity of the material. And again, every person that wrote to them was sure they had their unique little angle. And it was sure. It was automatic writing. It was in the dream, a dream state. It was, there was something, but it was never anything. It was their own selves, their own voice.
Barrie, we're going to take a short break here. Again, this is My Psychic Manifesto. I'm your host, Ian Peckrell. This is Barrie Gellis. We're going to come right back. Barrie will be on the next episode. And Barrie, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. The experiment continues.
Whisper in the darkness as the December sun goes down. Breeze blowing around your feet as you stumble from the ground. The secrets in the moving dust. Know why your heart still beats. The stairs leading from the house onto the sacred street.